Years ago, in a small, sleepy town, there was an old radio station called WNN Radio. The station was located in a large building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and old, empty streets. The building was big, with tall windows and long, dark hallways. People who worked there often said it felt strange, especially at night. Some claimed it was haunted, but most of them laughed it off. One of the radio hosts, a young man named James, worked late nights at the station. James was known for his late-night show, The Midnight Hour. He had a loyal following, and his show was popular for its funny calls, stories, and sometimes spooky themes. He often stayed after hours to finish his work, and sometimes, when the show ended, he'd sleep at the station instead of going home. One cold, autumn night, James found himself alone in the station. His last co-worker had just left, and the place felt unusually quiet. The only other person in the building was the night watchman, who usually stayed downstairs. James sat at his desk in the small studio, adjusting his microphone and setting up the playlist for the night. The station felt empty, the silence almost pressing against him. As usual, James began his show. He started with a few funny calls, pranking random listeners, making them laugh. It was his usual routine, and it worked. The calls went smoothly, and he felt his usual excitement filling the airwaves. But when James reached his last call of the night, things began to get strange. He dialed the number, expecting the usual. The phone rang for a long time, longer than it should have. James was about to hang up when someone finally answered, but instead of the usual hello on the other end, he heard only slow, heavy breathing. "Hello?" James asked, thinking it was just a joke or someone messing with him. The breathing continued, louder and more uneven, as if the person on the other end was struggling to breathe. James's smile faded. "Hello? Is everything all right?" There was no answer, just more heavy breathing. Then to James's shock, a soft whisper came through the line. It was his name, spoken slowly and softly. "James. James." His heart skipped a beat. No one knew his real name. He was known on air as DJ Midnight, but the voice on the phone had used his real name. Before James could respond, there was a loud, ear-piercing scream, and the call suddenly cut off. The room around him seemed to grow colder, and the lights above began to flicker. James's pulse quickened as he looked around, feeling like something was wrong. The phone signal on his screen flickered and disappeared, and he couldn't reach anyone. Suddenly, the room felt much colder. He could see his breath in the air. He stood up, shaking, and decided to leave the studio. As he stepped out into the hallway, he noticed the flickering lights in the hall, too. The shadows danced around him, making the place feel even more unsettling. "Hello?" James called out. "Is anyone there?" No one answered. He took a few more steps, looking around for the night guard. But as he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed something strange. A chair near the end of the hall began to move on its own, sliding toward him. James froze, his heart racing. The air felt thick and heavy. He quickly turned and rushed to the exit door, hoping to get out of the building. But when he tried the door, it was locked. Panic surged through him. He pounded on the door, shouting for the guard, but there was no reply. Then he heard something, a faint sound, like the soft jingling of anklets. It was almost a whisper, coming from behind him. Slowly, James turned. There, in the reflection of the glass door, he saw the shadow of a figure standing behind him. A woman. She was wearing a long white dress, her hair hanging over her face, hiding her features. James's breath caught in his throat. His body went stiff with fear. He quickly turned around, and there she was, standing in front of him. She didn't move, just stood there, with her head slightly tilted, her dark eyes locked onto his. Her face was pale, and her smile was twisted, as if she was enjoying his fear. The sound of her anklets echoed again, louder this time, and then, without warning, the woman's hand reached out toward him. She touched the glass door, and the glass shattered with a loud crack. The entire room went dark. James's heart pounded. He could barely see anything in the dark, except for the faint silhouette of the woman. She took a step closer, and he felt a cold wind blow through him. He couldn't move. Fear held him in place. Suddenly he felt a touch on his shoulder. His body tensed, but when he turned, it wasn't the woman. It was the night guard, holding a flashlight, looking confused, but concerned. "Sir, are you all right?" the guard asked, shining the light on James's pale face. James, still trembling, couldn't speak at first. "Did you see her? The woman in the white dress?" he stammered. The guard nodded, his face serious. "Yes, sir. We've all seen her. We thought it was just a story at first, but after a few weeks, we knew something wasn't right. They say she used to live in this building long ago, before it became the station. She's been haunting the place ever since." James shuddered. He realized then that he wasn't the first to experience this. The guard continued. "She doesn't want anyone here. We've heard strange noises, seen things move on their own, and felt her presence. A few nights ago, she appeared to us too. She said the building was hers and she would not let anyone stay." James had heard enough. After that night, he quit his job and left the station. He never returned, and he made sure never to work the night shift again. The memory of the woman in the white dress haunted him, and sometimes, when the night was still, he could still hear the soft sound of anklets, as if she was walking just behind him. And though James moved on to a new job, the legend of the woman in white lived on, reminding him that some places are better left untouched. There was a small, quiet radio station called WKR Radio, hidden on the outskirts of a town. The station had been there for years, and most people didn't pay much attention to it. The building was old and creaky, with dusty windows and dim lights that flickered sometimes. Despite this, it was the heart of the town's late-night broadcasts, and many people loved listening to the night shows. One of the most popular radio hosts was a young man named Tom. Tom was known for his late-night talk show, After Dark, where he would play music, tell stories, and prank his listeners. He loved making people laugh, and the show always had a lot of callers joining in. He worked the midnight shift, so the station was usually quiet and empty after hours, with only him and the night security guard, Mr. Harris, left in the building. One cold winter night, after his show had ended, Tom stayed behind to finish up some work. It was already past 2 a.m., and the station was completely silent. Mr. Harris had already left for his break, so Tom was alone in the station. The building felt unusually cold that night, but Tom just shrugged it off as normal. Tom sat at his desk in the small studio, adjusting his microphone and getting ready for his next shift. The station was mostly dark, with only the soft glow of the equipment in front of him. He picked up the phone to make a call, as he often did, to prank some of his regular listeners. He dialed a number, waiting for the connection to go through. The phone rang, but it rang for longer than usual. After a few moments, Tom was about to hang up, thinking the person wasn't answering. But then suddenly, someone picked up. Tom smiled, ready to start his usual routine. But what came through the line shocked him. There was no greeting, no response, only heavy, ragged breathing. "Hello?" Tom asked, a little confused. "Is everything all right?" The breathing continued, slow and deep, as if the person on the other end was struggling to breathe. Tom waited, but no one spoke. He felt a sudden chill in the room. "Hello, who is this?" he asked, his voice shaky. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, came the name, Tom. Tom. Tom's blood ran cold. His real name, no one outside of the station knew it. He had always gone by DJ Knight on the air. But this voice knew his real name. Before Tom could say anything, the phone line crackled and the call was cut off suddenly. The room went completely still. The lights above him flickered for a moment, and the air grew colder. Tom shivered, trying to brush it off as his imagination playing tricks on him. But something felt wrong. He looked around the dark room, trying to calm himself, when he noticed something strange. His phone signal had disappeared, and so had the radio signals. The equipment in front of him was flashing in and out of life. Tom felt his heart begin to race. He stood up and walked out of the studio, heading into the hallway to look for Mr. Harris. The hallway, usually quiet at night, felt even colder now. Tom called out, "Mr. Harris, are you there?" But there was no answer. The only sound was the soft creak of the old building. He walked down the hall, the lights flickering again. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and the shadows felt deeper, like they were watching him. Suddenly, a chair from the corner of the hallway began to slide toward him. Slowly, Tom froze, his blood turning to ice. The chair moved by itself, slowly scraping across the floor. Tom's heart pounded as he backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. He turned to run back to the studio, but when he reached the door, it was locked. Panic surged through him. He pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The building was now eerily silent, and he couldn't escape. He shouted for Mr. Harris again, but no one came. His voice echoed through the empty hall. Then, Tom heard something. Soft at first, like the sound of faint footsteps, but they grew louder. The unmistakable sound of someone wearing anklets, their gentle jingle echoing through the building. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He turned, looking down the hallway. In the reflection of the glass door, he saw a figure. A woman dressed in a white gown, standing motionless in the dark. Her face was hidden behind her long hair, and she didn't move. She just stared at him. Tom's throat tightened. He slowly turned to face the figure, and his stomach dropped. There she was, standing in front of him, the woman in white. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and her skin was pale. Her hands were long and bony, reaching out toward him. The jingle of her anklets filled the room, growing louder with each step. Tom's body was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The woman stepped closer, and with each movement, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The lights flickered wildly before going out completely, leaving only darkness. Then, in the pitch black, Tom heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear. "Leave, or you'll never leave." Terrified, Tom screamed, "No, let me go." He stumbled backward, trying to get away from her, but the woman reached out and touched his shoulder. The instant her fingers brushed against him, everything went silent. The cold disappeared, and the lights flickered back on. Tom blinked. He was back in the studio, sitting in front of his microphone. The phone was still on the hook, and the equipment was back to normal. He looked around, confused, trying to understand what had just happened. Was it a dream? Was he imagining things? Before he could think more about it, the door to the studio opened. It was Mr. Harris, the night guard. He walked in, looking concerned. "Are you all right, Tom?" he asked. "You look pale." Tom, still shaking, nodded slowly. I think I saw something. A woman in white." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "She's been here for years. Everyone who works the late shift sees her eventually. We just try to ignore it." Tom stood up, his legs weak. "I think I'm done for tonight." he said, his voice trembling. As he left the building that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. And though he never spoke of it again, Tom never worked late at the station again. He couldn't forget the woman in white, the cold air, and the whispers in the dark. The radio station, WKR Radio, continued to broadcast for many years, but every so often someone would mention hearing the faint sound of anklets late at night, echoing through the empty halls. And for those who stayed too long, the whispers would always follow.